So you know what happened when the rabbi told everybody that here we are on Yom Kippur, and one of the three reasons that we dress in white, one of them is that it's the color of the inside soul coming out Kabbalistically, and one is that it is the color of the priests because we are a nation of priests, as the Holiness Code says. And the third one is that we traditionally are buried in plain white, off-white linen shrouds. And so on this day, we get to posit the future self, the person from the deathbed looking back and saying, from that perspective, how is it that I had wished I had lived? And then channel that into our lives for the coming year, thus satisfying the requirements of Unetaneh Tokef. Live in such a way that dying is not a sentence, but life is a blessing. So there's the old joke that the rabbi told the congregation that and said, and I'm going to say basically the same thing to you. So your job is to think about, what do you want people to say about you at your funeral? And the rabbi turned around to the congregation and said, so I'm going to pick on you. What do you want people to say at your funeral? And the person says, I want them to say I was a mensch. The rabbi turned over there and said, what do you want people to say at your funeral? And the person said, I want them to say, I left the world better than I found it. And the rabbi pointed over there and said, and you, what do you want people to say at your funeral? And the person said, my God, I think they're still breathing. The only way I know any jokes is because you tell them to me. So the person who told me that joke over on Rosh Hashanah, thanks for telling me. Nevertheless, I have noticed in the work that I do that the older a person is when they die and pass from this earth into the next world, the shorter their eulogy gets. We have so much to say when we're younger. I gotta tell you, I found I was going through our stuff. Lynn and I are trying to get lighter with our load. We're not trying to keep things for years and years, so I was clearing out my files, the files of everything I thought was important, my high school journal, my college diary, my grades, my papers, all these things. They took up a couple of file cabinets. I'm down to a shoebox, and I'm hoping to go on from there. And one of the things I found when I was cleaning things out over the summer was my CV from my late 30s, my mid-30s. My gosh, it was 3.5 pages long, single-spaced, and I made the font as small as I could. Apparently, I'd forgotten all of these accomplishments and courses I taught and distinctions and all these things that I did. It's like, is that really me? I think that my CV today is, I'm a rabbi, I'm a conservative rabbi in Ann Arbor with a beautiful family. And I think that's all I need my CV to be. As we age, the record of our life, what we need to be remembered, gets shorter and shorter. The longest story of a person and his life is the story of Joseph, of Yosef in Breshit. You think he had a long story with Abraham, it's really only a couple parshiot. Isaac gets like one, sort of. And then you got Yaakov, gets like a good 2, maybe 2.5 if you count. And then Yosef goes on forever. Joseph, he grew up, he had dreams, his brothers, all this, the slaves. He became a slave, then he had the issues in Potiphar's house. He goes to jail, he fixes the jail, he comes out of jail, he interprets dreams, does this. Then he has the whole charades with his family. It goes on and on and on for a good part of Breshit. When his brothers, he unmasks himself to his brothers finally at the end, and they say, my gosh, you're alive. What have you been doing all of these years? Tell us everything that happened to you. And Yosef says, half a line. I got a chance to save lives. It's all he needs to be remembered by. The longer we live, the shorter our eulogy gets. I came across this organization in Canada, and they work with seniors. They work with people in the last, let's say, 15, 20, 25 years, perhaps, depending of their lives. And they noticed a pattern, which is that for caregivers who are listening, and those of us who are caregivers, this is going to resonate with you. At a certain age, we have 10 stories, and we repeat them over and over again. Now, this organization was created to give support to caregivers because the caregivers are like, I keep hearing the same stories over and over again. And so it was support for them. And part of what it said the organization is teaching them is to hear the stories a little differently, not to hear this, and it's not a consequence of dementia, and I don't think it has if it has a neurological component, it's not a neurological basis. As we get older, our stories decrease and decrease, and they've identified by listening and listening and listening and interviewing, we end up with about 10 stories that we repeat over and over again. I think the Torah is like the stories that our ancestors passed down to us. This is far more true than the superficial and reductionist take on the Torah, that it is an attempt at historical recording. And we could probably say what those 10 stories are. That's probably what we're teaching in the religious school, that infinity didn't have to produce the universe, but it did because partnership creates possibilities that are unpredictable and possible goods that are otherwise impossible, that the human is made in the divine image, unlike the other creatures. And what does that mean? That we are here to till and tend the earth and protect it, that we are our brothers and sisters' keeper, that humanity was ruining the earth, so God started over again, but that won't happen again because this one's for keeps. That it takes a people over generations to change the world, not an individual in one lifetime. That being enslaved and oppressed is probably the worst things humans do to ourselves as collectives, and that the memory of making it to freedom becomes fundamental for purpose. That we are commanded moral imperatives, even as God speaks in different words and voices to each person. That we attribute the good in our lives to the wrong sources, the golden calf. That as much as we are excited to move forward, we seem to always want to move backward. We overvalue the goods of the past more than of the future. That our life is spent as a form of wandering, as a journey, and that we best know how to live in the promised land of the future when it is time for the journey to be over and for us to pass it on to others. Abraham Joshua Heschel writes that our scripture is different than any other religion in its makeup, and it's something that connects the Mishnah and the Talmud with the Torah with continuity. Our Torah and the Mishnah and the Talmud, they are a jumbled, sort of awkward mixture of laws and stories, and neither gets priority. Halakhah, and you shall, and you shall, and you shall, and this is the way to keep kosher, and these are the laws of Shabbos, and this is the law of treating each other, and here's the case law, and stories in between, stories mixed together. Heschel writes, Halakhah represents the strength to shape one's life according to a fixed pattern. It is a form-giving force. Aggadah, story, is the expression of our ceaseless striving that often defies all limitations. Halakhah is the rationalization and schematization of living. It defines, specifies, sets measure and limit, placing life into an exact system. Aggadah, stories, deal with our ineffable relations to God, to other human beings, and to the world. Halakhah deals with details, each commandment separately. Aggadah with the whole of life, with the totality of our lives. Halakhah deals with the law, Aggadah with the meaning of the law. Halakhah with subjects that can be expressed literally. Aggadah introduces us to a realm that lies beyond the range of expression. Halakhah teaches us how to perform common acts. Aggadah tells us how to participate in the eternal drama. Halakhah gives us knowledge. Aggadah gives us aspiration. Halakhah, the norms for action. Aggadah, the vision of the ends of living. Halakhah prescribes. Aggadah suggests. Halakhah decrees. Our stories inspire. Halakhah is definite. Aggadah alludes. That's with an A, alludes. The interrelationship of Halakhah and Aggadah, according to Heschel, is the very heart of Judaism. He writes, Halakhah without Aggadah is dead. Aggadah without Halakhah is wild. So our stories and our laws are mixed together with quite the opposite of smoothness. One would think that our stories are illustrations of our laws, like a good law school course, but actually our stories generally are in tension with the laws themselves. God's delivering the Ten Commandments in Mount Sinai, but the story is that people are scared and want to get away. God is delivering the laws to Moses for 40 days and 40 nights. Meanwhile, there's a golden calf being made. Or the many strange interruptions in the Talmud and the Mishnah that make a life of Talmud study seem like one's always starting from the beginning. The rabbis decreed that chicken should be considered like meat, and so no one may eat dairy with it. But one day there was a rabbi who kept eating dairy with his chicken, and that is why we have Mar Da'atras. That is why God wants us to have individual rabbis ruling for their own communities, because of a rabbi who ate dairy with his chicken. I think it means it's better that we're not all the same. Stories, you're in the middle of the laws of homeowners associations. And it says, if you don't like what the HOA is doing, can you vote against it? And they say, you can vote against it, but if you lose, you still have to pay. And they say, we'll give you an example. HOAs sometimes like to get a guard to guard the in and out. So once time, and then it says, once a time, there was an HOA. And they put a guard for people entering the common area and who were not entering the common area. And that's what the law is. But there once was a man who used to feed a poor beggar in one community, and after they got a guard, the beggar couldn't get in. Turns out the beggar was just Elijah the prophet. You know, the one who can look like any poor or sick beggar on the street, but is the one who decides and announces when the Messiah is going to come. Events are the voice of God entering the world, says Heschel. I was struck, speaking of a short eulogy. Get the Kleenex ready. My family collected for my father's 90th birthday. Hard to collect, hard to get there. It was over COVID. There was a lot of driving, a lot of eating in the car, a lot of running in, holding one's breath to grab a glass of water somewhere on the way and get gas. We all collect. And I put on the recorder and I say, my dad's a rabbi, by the way, for you who don't know, he's streaming the service right now, they're members. So I said, Dad, I know you. You got a speech. And he said, heck yeah, I have a speech. I'm ready to go. And his speech was this. All of those things on my CV, all of those things that are my accomplishments in my life, they all happened to me. I didn't do them. He kept saying, the best things in life happened to me. This is a man who spent a couple years in Korea serving, not knowing if when he came back, he would be able to marry my mother, who was waiting for him, strangely enough, here in Ann Arbor. The best things in life happened in Ann Arbor. No, the best things in life happened to me. But that happened to him, he says. Getting to be with my mother. Getting to have a great synagogue. You know, we interview you, we do these things. Someone posted on Facebook. It happened to me. I got to have a great community. I got to be in a rabbi. These kids were so much trouble. They happened to me. His eulogy after a life of accomplishments was, it's short. If Joseph said, I got to save lives, I was lucky. My father says, the best things in life happened to me. The things others would call my achievements, they happened to me. And I think of what Heschel said about revelation that produces your stories. It's not merely an act of experience, but an act of being experienced. These 10 stories that people tell, right? Personally, I think I may only be in my 50s. I think I have about 10 stories. They may change, but I'm not sure I have more than that. What I've identified in these stories is that this person, we, are trying to make a point. And we're not sure how to make it, so we have to allude to it in Heschel's terms. You see, in Halakhah, it's easy. God spoke, and we wrote it down. But in the stories, God is in the stories, but doesn't make an appearance. Because it's the presence of God alluding through life. In my story, I studied hard and wrote an essay, and I got into that school. But if I keep saying it, the real story is where God was in all of that. How lucky was I? What happened to make it possible for me to go down that road? They find that the stories often come from your 20s and 30s. Times where you feel something, I think for the Jewish people, it was the Exodus, some time that gave you direction and in which the values that you were experimenting with once settled and hooked in. That's God's voice. When we're going through it, we think we did it. When we look back in our shrouds, we realize the hand of God was working through all. What we want to do with our stories is not just leave them as, I need to tell you again about when I served in Korea. I need to tell you again about when I served in Vietnam. What we are being asked to do is to go further and tell those listening to our stories, what are we trying to say? What are the intimations of God and our values that we want heard and that we want passed on? I keep going back to the Army, even though I'm 94. I felt part of a bond with people I've only felt with my family since. You need to bond with people and learn community. We've got to start spelling out the stories that we're telling, because if we just tell our stories over and over, it's just a bunch of chatter, and it probably includes a lot of complaining that people get tired of hearing about. We have to show people where our values and God are coming through our stories. Dr. Ann McColl writes, there are really just 10 stories that people tell over and over. But why? And what's getting communicated? They come often from a time when important decisions are made that shape the rest of the life and where one's values are set. As Kierkegaard wrote, life can only be understood backwards, though I must live it forwards. And as Erickson wrote, the final stage of life is reconciling the whole of one's life, achievements and disappointments. And as I write, on Yom Kippur, we are dressed in the garments of burial. We have a chance to look ahead in order to look back, so that we, on this day, may reconcile the whole of one's life, our achievements and disappointments, and invite God to express God's self through us. Dr. McColl writes, the resolution of the personal myth, the overarching story we tell about who we are and what we stand for and what's important to us. Stories are not just sitting there waiting to be recalled. Calling up our stories is an active process. Our stories are constructed like the stories of the Torah. We are more like musicians, she writes, than like librarians. We fill in the details over time. We paint over inconsistencies. We create the melody. The details are not the important part. What's important is the meaning embedded in the stories, the lessons learned, the value confirmed of the story. And Heschel writes, the meaning of awe is to realize that life takes place under wide horizons, horizons that range beyond the span of an individual life or even the life of a nation, a generation, or an era. Awe enables us to perceive in the world intimations of the divine, to sense in small things the beginnings of infinite significance, to sense the ultimate in the common and the simple, to feel in the rush of the passing, the stillness of the eternal. How can you bring those intimations out in your stories? How can you make your stories, and I think of the stories I hear from people about service, how is it communicating, which story of yours communicates duty? I now get to spend a lot of time with the director of the religious school. And as she's making all kinds of signs for the downstairs and writing all kinds of lessons, she said, Nadav, she's allowed to call me Nadav. She said, sweetie, what is your definition of mitzvah? And I said, it's duty. Where does duty come forward from one of your stories? That's something greater than yourself. Another intimation of what is greater is community. Another intimation of what is greater, this awe that Heschel is talking about, is tikkun olam, contribution to God's story, not God's role in your story. Where do you find in your stories belonging? The tribe I inherited, the family that happened to me either by inheritance or by my choice. How lucky I was to belong with them. Our intimations should be made explicit. There is a process that is happening within us. It is our spiritual lives. It is the process of Aggadah. And it is not biography any more than the Torah is history. As we sing Avinu Malkeinu, it says it's all about the books that God is inscribing. Isn't it interesting? I guess we think of Revelation as God talks and Moses wrote it down. In Avinu Malkeinu, we're doing the talking. And God's writing it down in a book. God's inscribing. How can we bring out in our cry the authenticity of feeling connected to that which is greater than ourselves? To tell God that my story, thank God, is part of your story and not the other way around. And when we get to Unetaneh Tokef, how do we lessen the severity of the morals of our stories, of the plots of our stories? How do we change our fate? By retelling and reconstructing our story. Well, narrative therapy, among other techniques, tells us a lot. It tells us that the story we keep telling, can we change it a little bit from that story about our trauma? Our trauma is real, but can we construct the story as also about resilience? Can it be a story not just of being a victim, but of being a survivor? Part of what I think is really successful with reconstructing your stories is humor. I remember in therapy many years ago, I was telling my therapist about a narcissist I had been involved with, and I kept not understanding why everything I did, it was okay for a while, but then I just couldn't please them. And the therapist started to laugh. And they said, that's the funniest thing I heard all day. And I'm like, it's not funny at all. It's my tragedy, right? I was in a relationship with a narcissist. It sounds like another article from The Atlantic. Or I was in a relationship with a narcissist, and I can tell you all about it. And so I'm like, that's hilarious. You were in a relationship with a narcissist, and somehow you couldn't figure out why you just couldn't keep pleasing them. Sometimes our stories need to just look at our lives and laugh at the show. Just laugh at the show. Can we say the values and then they create more stories like them and live the values, not as a contributor to identity, but as our active identity. I know one person whose stories are very much about what it was like to be a woman in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And what they do now in their 90s is they formed a group, largely of folks of the same era, and now they read books and they politically advocate for people all along the gender spectrum. Because they realized what the value was in the stories that kept telling over and over again. And now they knew how to take those values forward in the world. It is Aggadah, Heschel writes, that keeps on reminding us that the purpose of performance is to transform the performer. That the purpose of observance is to train us in achieving spiritual ends. Halakhah is the deed. Aggadah is the individual experience of the collective life of deeds. There's no Halakhah without Aggadah. There's no Aggadah without Halakhah. We must neither disparage the body nor sacrifice the spirit. The body is the discipline, the pattern, the law. The spirit is the devotion, the spontaneity, and the freedom. The body without the spirit is a corpse. Spirit without the body is a ghost. Thus, a mitzvah, Heschel writes, is both a discipline and an inspiration, an act of obedience and an experience of joy, a yoke and a prerogative. Our task is to learn how to maintain a harmony between the demands of Halakhah and the spirit of Aggadah. So I'm going to ask you right now, I know you've already been thinking it, think of one of your 10 stories. What is one story that you know? If you were being interviewed right now, you got a few stories to tell me your life, what do you got to tell me? Think of one of your stories. I want you to observe the hidden hand of the transcendent in it and acknowledge it. If there is a moral in it, say it. If it connected you to something greater than yourself, name it. If it's very serious, bring out the humor a bit more. It's okay to go for a laugh. I did at the beginning of the sermon, and it's very hard for me. If there's a part of it that says, I did these things, rephrase it as, the best things in life happened to me. If you are the protagonist of the story, can you retell the story where you're a character in a story rather than the center of it? This is what we're here to do. As the books are open above our heads, as the gates are open, as we've gone from listening to God listening to us, our stories contain God when we are willing to rise to that level, and only when we rise to that higher state can we truly teach ourselves and our children that the reward for doing the mitzvot is not some reward or punishment from God, it's the opportunity to experience the world differently. And that is what Unetaneh Tokef is trying to teach us. What is the life of experiencing the world differently? A perspective that comes from seeing it from its end backward, that takes the threat of death to one's ego out of the equation. When we do this, the harshness of our mortality is lessened. We have our moment before the Holy One in life. If it's all about me, then it cannot be but harsh that it comes to an end. But if it's looking back from our future self, if it's about participating in the larger story, it's excruciatingly precious. I often say that the fundamentalist mistake in reading the Torah is to think that God is dictating and Moses is stenographer. Our liturgy is telling us today, God is the one writing in the books. And maybe we're the ones dictating our stories. May you use the rest of this holiday to think about a couple of your stories. Retell them. Make God, the Transcendent, a character in your story. Make the intimations explicit. Shana Tova.